Hello, check. Hello.
I am also here.
The boss came and checked out the mics, and I think they're all the same. Okay.
Hello. Hi, everyone. We get started here.
I know, that's why I'm trying not to slow. Sit up straight.
All right, guys, my name's Eddie Gobo. I'm going to be moderating this little roundtable discussion we have. It's based on the book Perpetual Conversion. The subject of the book and the author are to my right. I'll introduce them both right now. First to the guy on my far right. He's the author of the book. He is a great music fan, a wrestling fan, a sports fan.
That is true.
He's a flagship employee at this place, Reckless Records. And most importantly, he's my friend, Dave Hoffer, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks for coming. This is completely bizarre. Thank you.
And the man to my direct right is a guy who, you know, the cliche saying needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway because I hate that saying. He's a legend in the heavy metal scene. He is, in my opinion, one of the most recognizable bass players in the history of heavy metal. He's been in a bunch of legendary bands. When people say the world ends, there'll be two things left, cockroaches and Cher. I disagree. I think it's going to be Cher and this man, Danny Loker. Welcome.
Thank you.
So here's what we'll do, which is I want to hit some points in this book. I want to go through the process of how it was made, and then I want to, we'll open it up to some questions at the end of this. So keep those in your back pocket if you got them until then. So this book, Perpetual Conversion, I remember distinctly many years ago at this point, me and Dave Hoffer had a lunch together, and we had the old, so what are you up to, man, conversation. And he's like, well, I'm actually writing a book. I'm starting to write a book. And I'm like, really? I knew Dave had a history with writing, so I was stoked on it immediately. But he said I was basically going to be writing a biography about Danny Loker, and immediately, like, the room got lit in my head. I was like, that's a great idea. And the reason is because I'm a big fan of a good rock bio book, but I don't think it was ever, up until this point, properly represented from the stance of an underground perspective. It's usually the big rock star with the big tour bus, all the money, all the hookers, doing that whole thing. And this was going to be a different perspective, and I was very interested to read it.
No hookers.
So yeah, I was stoked on the idea. And one of the first things I want to address is, and it's touched upon in the book, but I want to delve deeper into it, which is, we'll start with Dave. How'd the idea for this book come about, David?
Well, it was in February of 2008, selling merch. Well, 07 was the first time I went on tour with Brutal Truth, selling the merch. And yeah, that was an experience. And then did it again the following February in 08. And that was on just some random drive, just BSing. It's just like the lightning bolt moment that everybody always talks about, like, why doesn't that exist? I should do that. And then when we got back, it just like kind of came up, but I didn't want to like push it, you know? And then when we got back, just sent an email like, about that idea, maybe we should try to do something. And Danny was on board, and there it went.
I think the best thing is that there's a situation where Danny Loker might be the best subject for a book like this, because not only is he heavily tied to the underground and has that very underground perspective, but he also has that mainstream tie, which we'll get into in a minute. So based on that, Danny, I wanted to pick your brain about it, which is when Dave approached you about the idea of doing the book, since you have such that blue-collar DIY attitude, did it scare you off at any point? Because you can't really maintain that attitude doing basically having a biography about yourself, because you're the subject, you're in the forefront, and I wanted to see if there was any reservations you had once you were approached with the idea.
Well, probably the biggest reservation was going, shit, I'll never remember all the stuff that he wants to ask me, so the book's going to be pretty boring. But no, in all seriousness, I've obviously played in bands for years, but when you play in a band, you are a member of a tiny little community, and the onus is not just on you. You're a member of a group, it's 3 or 4 other people. So when this came about, like it's going to be a book that's going to be about me, that was a little intimidating because it was just basically all about me. And just for that reason, just being used to being a dude in a band with a bunch of other dudes, and it was, yeah, a little bit like, oh boy. But people that we spoke to are like, dude, I would totally buy a book about you. So we were like, okay, cool.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. And what's interesting about the book is you mentioned, obviously, you're in bands. For those of you who read the book, it is not only divided, it's not by chapters, it's divided by basically the bands Danny's been in. So that's what's great about it. You could basically, if you feel like reading about nuclear assault, you just turn to the nuclear assault section, you read it through, and you pick up where you left off. And I think that I've read the book a couple times, but obviously I see myself about a year from now doing a thing where it's like, yeah, I feel like reading about SOD for a little bit. Go to the SOD section. It's pretty easy like that. And as you mentioned, Danny, like it's all about the dudes you've been in bands with, and Dave actually has interviewed several of them, and they're in this book right here.
Yes.
So like that was cool. And we'll talk about the process about that a little bit. Actually, let's start with we'll comb through sort of Danny's legacy a little bit. And as many of you know, it starts in Queens, New York. Back in the day when he started a band with Scott Ian, and it was called Anthrax. So that's pretty much the first chapter in this book as far as the mainstream evolution of Danny Loker. I want to talk about Anthrax really quick and just touch upon it because I think a couple things, which is, and this question's for Dave, when we're in a situation where you're getting interviewed, or when you're interviewing these dudes that were wrapped up in Danny's life, I think the most represented guy in this book, besides Danny, obviously, is Scott Ian from Anthrax.
Yes.
And a couple things based around that, which is one, Scott was in Anthrax, or I mean, Danny was in Anthrax with Scott, and also obviously he was in Stormtroopers of Death with Scott.
Yes.
So the thing, I mean, not to put a fine point in it, when I was reading Scott's interview sections, they came off almost a little guarded at times. I think that he came across as one of the more PC people in it. Like he didn't want to say things that I think you may be trying to drag out of him. So I want to talk to you about that process of interviewing one of the biggest guys in the book that you got to interview.
Okay, well, he was the first person I interviewed that wasn't Danny actually, and yeah, you just sent an email being like, hey, if you want to maybe be interviewed for this book, get in touch with this guy, me. And Scott was one of those people, and he wrote back and was just like, yo, no problem. Here's my number, here's a time. That time came and passed, and I was like, well, or no, I just had his email address, so I didn't have his phone number because he was gonna call me. And so I sent him an email being like, hey, I know you're busy, we were supposed to talk 30 minutes ago, we can set up a different time to do it. And then the phone rang, immediately after that. And he's like, no, I'm just sitting in traffic, dude, we'll just do it right now. I'm like, okay, cool. And so the things that I asked him about, actually, I was really happy to hear, perfectly mirrored what Danny had already told me, which, gave it, was, validated. And I don't know, I didn't feel like he was super guarded. I mean, I get what you're saying because he is kind of like a professional talker.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
So, but he was on the level, and then I read his book when it came out, and it was the same thing again. So I'm like, okay, if that's the case, he's sticking to his story, But I mean, it just matched, and he was totally cool. Didn't have to go through any record label, publicist sort of thing. I only have 15 minutes to talk kind of deal. He was really cool.
I think that one of the things that's impaired in this book is the fact that Danny's stamp on the band Anthrax, the style that came after that, I think was the blueprint made heavily by Danny and Scott Ian. Would you agree with that, Danny? I think it's a situation where really a lot of your influence came across, and they just followed the blueprint and took it to an insanely high level after you left the band.
I actually think that after I left the band and started Nuclear, they got Joey and went, and at least on Spreading the Disease, it seemed to actually get a little more melodic and everything, but then they kicked it up a notch definitely on Among the Living, because by then we had done the SOD record and Charlie enjoyed playing fast and everything. But I kind of think that the riffs that I wrote on Fistful of Metal, I think that aspect of the band wasn't in the band afterwards, and I'm not saying that to their detriment or anything. I'm just saying I had my certain style, and then it was Anthrax without that.
Sure.
But they still went on to be a great band. I'm not saying because I wasn't in the band, they fell off and sucked. No, it's just kind of evil riffs like in Death Rider, they weren't really there anymore, but that's cool. They still wrote a bunch of good shit. What's up, dude?
There was, I want to talk about one more thing Anthrax related, which was, obviously a lot of people were interviewed in this book. I think we get introduced to our one and only, and I've used this term very loosely, I don't mean anything weird by it, but our only bad guy in the book, which is ex-Anthrax vocalist Neil Turbin, because obviously him and Danny butted heads, which is the reason why Danny ended up moving on from that band. But based on that, was he reached out to be interviewed for this book?
Yes, in the days of MySpace, because again, this all started coming together in like, early 2008. And so yeah, he obviously was somebody that I reached out to and actually heard back from on MySpace at some point. I think maybe we had one for the book. I never had one. So yeah, and he wrote back being like, sure, I would do an interview. I was like, okay, great. I have no clue what I'm doing, you know. And then there was the magazine Snake Pit came out, and there was like a history of early Anthrax piece in there, and you were interviewed for that, and it was all the same shit that we talked about. And then Neil's portion was like the complete opposite, and like came across as like very defiant. And at that point, I had come further in the process and had already talked to Danny and Scott and heard the same story from both of them. So I was just like, he said his piece, you know. And I think I actually reached out to the editor of Snake Pit also at one point, being like, hey, maybe we could like reproduce some of this in here, and then it just kind of like fizzled out. I feel like Snake Pit had that one covered.
I think the theme of the book is actually really laid out right around that time, which is perseverance and just not looking back. Once it was, I think every rock autobiography, when they go through any struggles, it's like, I cried myself to sleep for a year, and this is like not with Danny. It was like, what's on to the next thing, and I think that's awesome. I think that's a great recurring theme for this book in your life, Danny. So that leads to the next thing, which is actually a project with Scotty and Charlie from Anthrax, which is the project SOD. I think at the end of the day, it's ironic because it's the band you've done the least amount of shows, at least from your, as far as your main bands go. Only a couple albums, but I think at the end of the day, it's the band that you'll be remembered the most by because of the ground you guys broke. And that's so awesome, and it really defines less is more in the music world. So you guys got the SOD record rolling now. As far as SOD goes, I think it's one of the most groundbreaking bands in the history of metal. I think it was a perfect storm. I think that when it came down to it, the record came out in 1985. It was, this is the record, Speak English or Die. It had that mainstream tie because Anthrax was in the midst of blowing up. You were still heavily tied to the underground, the New York hardcore scene. Billy Milano, the vocalist, was also involved in that. And you guys just had a very satirical look at things. And that and the record being all around awesome is what brought it to the forefront, and it was controversial, and it gave everyone the balls to do something else after that because you sort of broke down the door with that. Quick question for Dave, really quick, which is I do see the record as very controversial. I still to this day see it. One of the best interviews, which is short in the book, is with Barney Greenway from Napalm Death, and he says basically, I like the riffs on that record, but there's a lot of things which are real questionable lyric-wise.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know him well enough, but I don't know. He was very honest about that, and so I was like, okay, well, this whole book can't just be like everything is great all the time. You have to have, a little bit of balance in there at least. And yeah, I mean, what he said in there was just like, I heard the music before I realized what the lyrics were kind of like, and it was just like, okay, this is very heavy, and then saw the lyrics and was kind of like, I don't know.
You know what's weird is, do you think a
But
band...
he didn't say, it was like, I hate this. Or
Yeah. And also Barney is like a very Jello Biafra-esque, which is addressed in the book, where it's like, this isn't the right message, I'm putting my foot down with it. But that being said, it obviously had a satirical angle to it. Do you think a band like, what's weird about a band like SOD is I think they were controversial in '85. I don't know if I think they'd be equally as controversial now if a band like that came out, which I think is rare to say. Like, it's like Marilyn Manson was controversial in '96. Nowadays, he's as controversial as Miley Cyrus. It's like that. So, that would be a band that if you place them in today's day, it would be equally as controversial in my opinion.
Well, yeah, what's also interesting about it is that a lot of the themes are, the more things change now, the more things,
You mean like fuck the Middle East?
For example, yeah. But yeah, I don't know. You could speak on that.
Sure.
Sure. I mean, the whole concept behind that was let's be as obnoxious as possible and see how many people we can piss off. Kind of like a sociological experiment. Looking back on it now, perhaps maybe it was a little over the top. So when Billy went on to do MOD and like have songs like AIDS and stuff, I'm like, all right, that's all you, buddy. Gonna do something a little more serious now. I don't regret it completely. Maybe just the amount we went to, but because some people that were genuinely, you know, like Barney, for instance, you know, it's just, oh, that's a bit dodgy, I don't know, you know. But anyway, yeah, for people like that, but of course he knows, and I go, dude, you know, if I would have done that again, we probably would have toned it down a tiny bit, but paradoxically, I don't regret it either.
No, that's what I was going to say. I was going to ask you if you had any regrets, and I think you summed it up perfectly. This is the following question is one I've been meaning to ask you for years. I've never met you, obviously, but I've been holding in the back of my head, which is the Speak English or Die record came out in 1985. Obviously, you guys are based out of New York City. It caught fire in that area. In '86, I think an equally controversial record came out, also from the New York area. And I think a lot of the people involved in it has since renounced that record, so to speak, and that's the Beastie Boys record License to Ill. I was wondering if you ever got wind of those dudes and Rick Rubin being into the SOD record, because I think that would push them over the cliff to go farther and farther if they were into that.
I never heard any possible connection about that. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I never heard anything about that they were psyched with that or Rick Rubin. I think those guys are just obnoxious Jewish dudes from Brooklyn.
No, and I think they followed sort of where you guys, also the obnoxious angle that you guys played up, but I just thought about asking that. So SOD wasn't really able to tour in '85, even though the record was blowing up, because Anthrax was, part of that whole cog, and they had to, go forth with that, and that's what they did. Again, the less is more thing, I think, ended up working out for you guys in the better. And that's when you it was started before that, but obviously you got heavily into Nuclear Assault with that, which is the band that I think has spanned the longest time, and also you're playing with them tonight, obviously. But you were able to see sort of the most of the world from that. I think that you guys released a bunch of records during that, which were pivotal records, and that was really the one that I think tied you to the mainstream the most because of the great tours you guys got on. And also the fact that it was approaching the mid '80s at that point, and I think that's when thrash metal was just blowing up left and right, and you were able to sort of get wrapped up in that whole mix where everyone was just, yearning for it and was just so stoked on Metallica, Slayer, and all this stuff, and then you guys were one of those bands that just helped carry the torch. And I think that what's commendable about Nuclear, and it's talked about a lot here, which was you guys were willing to play like the weird countries, do like the cool tours versus we're not going on tour, that arena tour with Metallica, let's just stay home. You guys did a lot of cool things like that, and because of that, your legacy grew, I would say.
And hardcore shows.
Exactly, yeah, there was that crossover vibe to it. As mentioned in the book, I think that what happened was with Nuclear Assault came more money from labels, more label involvement, a tour bus. And this is when, the first time in the book that I've noticed the creepiness of the rock industry sort of creeps in the mix. As you mentioned, Danny, like there's, or it's talked about here, the labels involvement, money, there's a few weird stories where it's just you interacting with people that, frankly, are acting like rock stars, and it was a weird time for everyone. So when it comes down to that, I want to talk about just, it looks like, I would say, if I'm summing up the Nuclear Assault chapter in this book, you're looking back fondly, but it's like with an asterisk next to it, like you experienced some things that turned you off to the music industry to some degree based on the Nuclear Assault chapter, I would say.
Well, yeah, absolutely, because, and nothing with the band, it's just that
Yes.
we had gotten to the point with labels and touring and everything that we had reached a certain plateau. Excuse me. I'm used to playing bass, not talking. Anyway, we had reached a point where we had to involve ourselves to function on this level and have sell this many records and be promoted. You had to associate yourselves with people that me coming from just underground punk rock metal thing, you know, there were things where I had ethical issues with people because I wasn't used to it, like just booking, I'm not naming names, but people from booking agents and labels and other people in the professional music industry that it was just hard to reconcile with, just because I didn't come from that. So, you know, just having to deal with people who obviously did not, let's put it this way, like in the 80s when there were bands getting signed, like Nuclear Assault, Exodus, Testament, blah, 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 they weren't getting signed because the dude who ran the label, for the most part, was a big fan of the bands. They were recognized as a original marketable product. So, you know, Metallica came out and on Megaforce and blew up, so basically, when you reach a point where the people that you're working with don't really give a shit about the music or the message you have, they just see you as something that they can just put on a shelf, then that kind of fucked with me a little bit. Sure. You know, and getting to the level where you had to deal with people like that was kind of alienating sometimes, yes.
I do have a bit of a fascination with, that stuff is kind of prevalent in the book because, yeah, I have a bit of a fascination with like the record business of yesteryear, you know, when things like that happen, which they don't anymore, huge advances, just like crazy, you know, making music videos, you know, going on Headbangers Ball, you know, just like that doesn't exist anymore. So it's just kind of, I don't know, I tried to like push it up a little bit in the book just because it was a bizarre time.
Sure, I think there was a lot of quote-unquote time slot hits for bands around that time, like bands that shouldn't have been big, that got big. Nuclear's not one of them. I think you guys totally were an outstanding band, but based on that, there was just a lot of bands that were like, that band was that big, I'm going on that tour, getting that money. But that was the time, you know, everyone just wanted to jump on that thrash metal bandwagon. Once Nuclear sort of wrapped up, I think there was an apparent rebirth with the existence of Brutal Truth, and I think that, I'm not going to speak for Dave, but I think that's probably your favorite bands of Danny's,
yeah,
right?
That and SOD, for sure. I really didn't know anything about Nuclear Assault going into it, which I think maybe even worked to my advantage a little bit. I don't know. I felt like it made it kind of easier, at least like not being like super familiar with everything already, you know, then it would be kind of pointless. Like, yeah, I knew that. Don't you mean 1986? You know, that kind of thing. So, but yeah, Brutal Truth and SOD. But yeah, I mean, I guess I would probably have to give the edge to Brutal Truth because that coincided with the whole weed thing. So it's like, okay, you know. But I mean, I could probably still quote all the stage banter from Live at Budokan, like,
Me too.
this second.
Danny, with Brutal Truth, I think it was, again, like a rebirth for you. You attribute a lot of the influence of Brutal Truth to those early Napalm Death records and how you were influenced by that. And I think that it starts a new chapter for you because it shows you as, for lack of a better description, the ability to genre jump in metal. You were a thrash guy, and then it's like you got into this grind mix, and you're like, you never really looked back. And Brutal Truth was equally as groundbreaking on the grind scene as your other bands were in the thrash scene, which is, it's amazing to say that. I think what happens with dudes in bands is when they start genre jumping, they have their one touchstone, and then it's like, well, we're gonna do this project and it's cool, and it's basically ripping off whatever band they wanna rip off, and then it's like, that's cool, but they always have that touchstone.
And they always go lighter.
Yes, that's true. And what's great about that is, you know, right around that time you have bands that like were doing the Metallica thing. Metallica got extremely lighter and they called it Metallica, and I think it's still for the best, but at the same time, you're like, new project, I'm not gonna try to implement grind in Nuclear Assault. Actually, you said a few of the guys in Nuclear didn't even like grindcore, didn't respect it that much. And that
Tell them there's a story in there about getting out of the van and then the guys from Agatha, please. That's funny.
Oh, I think it was just, yeah, right at the very end, the last Euro tour I was doing in '92, and with Nuclear Assault, and we rolled up to a venue in Belgium, and this was kind of like, also, this was a mini festival, and Obituary and Napalm had slots higher on the bill than Nuclear. So, when other dudes in the band in Nuclear weren't completely taking grindcore serious. That's a bunch of fast noise. I'm like, well, gee, they got a playing higher in the bill than us, man. I'm not sure everybody else agrees with that. So while that whole thing's going on, we get there, we slide open the van door, and then one of the guys from Agathocles runs up and goes, Danny, I wanted to talk to you about Brutal Truth and blah, blah, blah. And everybody was rolling their eyes, and I was like, you see?
Yeah, that's a great story in that book, for sure. Love it. And I think Brutal Truth could be summed up with this for me. On my 21st birthday, I went down the street and saw you guys play at the Double Door with Pig Destroyer. It's mentioned in this book. It was a reunion show of sorts. Now, it was my 21st birthday. That's a 21 over club. I got in for the first time there. It was the greatest night of my life up until that point. And what was great about that show was this, which is I rolled up, it's my birthday, Pig Destroyer is playing, and they just come out and whoop it. And I was like, this band is unbelievably tight. They are still one of the tightest like grind bands ever. Now, then you guys came up. In my 21-year-old brain, I saw you play, and I was stoked to see it, and I thought it was, frankly, less tight than Pig Destroyer. I went to work the next day, and I thought about the show, and I played it over my head, and I realized something which was pivotal, and it was apropos that I was turning 21 and becoming a man, so to speak. But when it comes down to it,
deep.
It's starting to sound like a metal bar mitzvah.
Yeah, this was frankly that. I played over that show in my head, and then I was like, well, Brutal Truth wasn't as tight, but they had a vibe to it. It was sloppier, but there was more aggressive. And then by the end of the day, I just kept convincing myself, and by the end of the day, I said to myself, you know what? Brutal Truth killed Pig Destroyer. I think what happened was I started changing my way of thinking, which is the tightest band isn't always the best band because tightness is only one facet of something. And that was, case in point, I saw you guys years later with Nasm, and that band is unbelievably tight. But they have the assistance of a click track, amazing amps or whatever. But you guys just come out and just do your thing and whoop it. And when it comes down to it, that's the punk rock influence in it. That's that energy. It's way sloppy. But that was something that I think pinpointed.
But it is still tight, though.
Exactly. And I think that really, sums up your legacy with it, which always has that looseness to it, but it's a vibe created to it. And it's a vibe you really can't teach. You can't teach it in a room. You just gotta, the way you teach yourself and you know how to do it is you go to these shows and you see those punk rock bands, you see the hardcore bands. And I think that, I just want to address that apparent influence in your music, which I think has been really, it spanned all your bands, essentially.
With Brutal Truth, I think the whole point was get really high and play as fast as possible.
Sure.
And that gave it that slightly chaotic feel. But in all seriousness, when we were playing at the tempos we were playing, having it be like perfectly tight would be too clinical for me. I mean, I've seen bands like Necrophagus where it's all perfect and they're doing sweeps over blast beats and it stops on a dime, but it's just, for me, that's just kind of flatline. Having it loose around the edges and chaotically fast just makes it more organic. And I would gladly sacrifice that, being perfectly tight just to have something that just feels completely pure.
Sure, and so you would probably agree with me that tightness in bands these days is overrated as far as the metal scene goes. Seriously,
Well, no, you have to have your shit together and play the song correctly. And everybody has to know what song you're playing. But, yeah, for instance, we wouldn't rehearse and go, we gotta do that song again because, not everybody ended on the same note. Or it's like some bands benefit from that. Like a band like Meshuggah, they're really good at that super tight. And I saw those guys at a festival once in Italy, and they played this perfect show, and then they came backstage and started arguing with each other. And you could tell, even if it was Swedish, just like, yeah, but you're supposed to stop. And they're like, dudes, do you think anybody else noticed besides the five of you? And they're like, I suppose you're right.
Outstanding. I think it's important to realize that, I totally agree with what you're saying, which is tightness could be overrated, and it's hilarious because Meshuggah is one of the tightest bands ever. But so that gets us to the point where I want to address. This is when you guys sort of met each other, which is the Brutal Truth, right around that time of the Double Door show. Because Dave, you went to Europe with these dudes.
Yes, right after that.
Exactly. Yes, and I remember you telling me about that, and I was stoked for you. I was like, this is gonna be great. I want to get initial first impressions of each other from you. So why don't we start with Dave?
It was actually kind of funny because my into that was actually through Kevin, the singer of Brutal Truth, because he worked in the neighborhood. And somebody at one point had tipped me off. They're like, dude, did you know that the singer from Brutal Truth works at Santullo's? And I was just like, that sentence just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But I went over and like looked, you know, and kind of like stalked him a little bit. Like, oh, but he doesn't have long hair anymore, and he has this big, is this him with the big beard? But, so yeah, we just became like neighborhood buddies. And then after the Double Door show, which was in September of '06, right? Then that February of '07, I just kind of like weaseled my way through Kevin, basically, and Rich, because I was on a big Exit 13 kick, and so just being like the inquisitive person that I am, somehow got in touch with Rich, and then Danny just being like, what was up with Exit 13? That was kind of weird, huh? And then them writing back, you know, and Rich at one point, I think he had mentioned the tour, and I just like kind of half joked about going as a roadie, and that just like turned into a reality. I just paid my way and went just to do it, you know. But yeah, so since it was kind of through Kevin, I remember we all met in Newark, and that's when it kind of dawned on me in the airport. I was like, oh, I'm gonna be like riding around in a van with the dude from SOD for like 8 days here. This is crazy. And so yeah, you know, I mean, basically that whole time, because I didn't really, I mean, I only knew Kevin like a little bit and like had never even met any of the other guys. So I basically was just like, I am just like not speaking until spoken to, basically, and trying not to like be like, I have questions about Live at Budokan. Yeah. Just make sure the money is there at the end of the night from the merch, and don't say anything stupid. Yeah, I was selling t-shirts, which I had never done before, so that was nice that they trusted me with that. So yeah, I don't know, I mean, I guess I would say I was a little starstruck, but Danny just like, I don't know, he just reminds me of my friends, basically, just easygoing, like, you know, ready to laugh.
Danny, your impression of Dave first time?
Oh my God.
Here we go.
I'm curious, I guess.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, perhaps I didn't say, wow, I'm going to be riding around in the van for 8 days with this dude. But, no, Dave was a cool dude, and it was cool to meet him, and it was great that he was doing merch for us, because if there's one thing I really hate, it's selling merch. You know, after some dude runs up and goes, hey dude, we're gonna go in the alley and burn one, then I have to go back and merch that and go, all right, what's 25 plus 7? 32, I know. The point being that Dave was a cool dude, and this was a van tour of England, and you know, in reference to what he was saying before, yeah, I'm not a rock star asshole, so I'm easily approachable. I'm, hey dude, what's up? And fucking, do you think that guy over there's got some hash? I smelled it. Yeah.
There was that bond.
Yeah, so, yeah, and then when we did the tour of Europe a year later, that's when the genesis of the book idea started. We were driving around in Spain, and it was sunny Spain. I mean, even if it's February, it's hot and sunny. And just killing time, because it's a 6-hour drive to Madrid, and I was just telling funny stories about shit back in the day, and you know, somebody eventually always says, dude, you should write a book. And I was like, I would never, first of all, I don't have the organizational skills for that, and I would never remember all that, and that's when Dave just jumped in and said, I'll do it! And that's why we're here.
I think when I first heard that you guys had were in the process of putting together, but I remember saying to myself that you guys might be two peas in a pod. I've been reading interviews with you forever, Danny, and you've always seemed very versatile, and you know, in music, liking different styles of music. Dave, one of the first times I met him, he was playing in a thrash metal band with a drum kit that had a bunch of punk stickers on his drum head, wearing an Eazy-E shirt. So I mean, he is very similar to that as well. So I'm like, these guys could really hit it off.
That was one thing also that like later on made it self-evident, is that open-mindedness to music of all kinds.
Definitely. I think that people who are open-minded to music understand other people of the sorts, and then the opposite actually. If you're not open-minded, you don't understand where the hell other people are coming from. So you talk about this is where you guys started piecing together the book. It was, if I'm not mistaken, you flew out to where Danny lives. It was the New Jersey area 3 times. Is that
Rochester,
correct?
New York.
Rochester, New York. Okay.
Bite your tongue.
Yeah, exactly. So you flew out to Rochester 3 times, and
Yeah.
describe to me the sort of interview setting for those meetings.
The gazebo. Yeah, so I mean, again, this is all just like a labor of love. So just scuttled away some money or used a credit card probably, I don't know, and just flew myself to Rochester.
Sunny, warm Rochester.
Yeah, and well, it was September, so yeah, no, it was nice. But yeah, and then I also need to give a shout out to Danny's wife because she knew me even less. And it was just like, okay, yeah, I guess like I'll fly out here and just like crash on your couch, which was offered to me. I didn't just assume that. I was looking into hotels. Yeah, so no, they just let me like crash on the couch, and so the day basically would go like get up, coffee, blaze, probably, and then just go out in the gazebo in front of their place, and just like, I don't know. I had like some notes, I guess. I think I may have actually still have like the notebook that I tried to use at that point, which is hilarious to look at. It's just like, ask about game over, with a question mark, completely useless. But yeah, we would just like let the digital recorder go, and just the first time was just like, okay, let's just start at the beginning.
The magnitude of something like this, for him to put this whole thing together, it's like, holy shit, how do you want to do this? You want to do it by band, by decades or so?
Yeah.
He'd had to really not struggle, but
I
envision
struggled.
what he wanted to do.
Yeah, so yeah, the first trip there is just, they were all long weekends. So we just like started from the beginning and just got like basically the outline, I guess. And then went back X amount of months later and was like, okay, I've transcribed all of these interviews. You mentioned this stuff that like we completely didn't talk about, like any follow up, or like this person's name came up 4 times. Who the fuck is this? Like, and yeah, so that was kind of like a fill in the gaps thing. And then the third trip was just more of that. We also did interviews here after the second Double Door show over at Doug's place. Like a little brunch session. Did like 3 hours there, and then some phone stuff here and there. So yeah, the bulk of it though was done in Rochester in the gazebo.
Danny, do you remember Dave ever sort of annoying you in this process? Like, did he ever dig too deep a little bit and you got pissed off?
Nah, I mean, the only thing that was annoying was when he asked me something I couldn't remember. We did a lot of stuff where I had to go through all my shit and find tour books and so all the pictures and all the cool
right.
things. Those were also good little memory prods. Like, when did you tour with Exodus in Europe? Oh shit, look, I have the laminate with all the dates on it, with all the venues on the exact day. I'm like, well, here, read that.
It's awesome.
Or a tour book, an itinerary. Your next place is you're playing in Weidbaden, Germany. It is 500 kilometers, and you must be there at 12 o'clock.
It's awesome.
Yeah, that was on, I think probably the third trip where I just like brought my laptop and a scanner and an external hard drive, and we just like went through all that shit, and then like anything that fit on a scanner, like the 11x17 scanner, I just scanned and brought home on the hard drive. And then he also mailed me just like these 3 boxes of old magazines and flyers and all sorts of stuff, like as research materials. And there would be interesting things too. You'd try to figure out like, I don't know, like there was like some things in there where like a specific show would be mentioned, and then I would happen to find like a live review of it, which would have like the date of the show in the review. It's like, okay, so that happened that time, and then just brought all this stuff back, and anything that was too big to fit on a scanner, we just took like high quality photographs of and assembled it that way.
So, Dave, once the book was essentially pieced together, what roadblocks came up in the actual publication of the book, if any?
Well, the publication of the book would be one major we had a publisher initially that expressed interest, but was just basically a flake, dragging his feet forever. But the ironic thing about it is that he basically got the ball rolling on all the design work and then really dragged his feet. So had we not ever like associated with the first publisher, then we wouldn't have been able to turn around to Handshake and be like, we have this book that's 90% complete. Do you want to release it instead? So it's like, okay, that's weird how that kind of shook out, but that was the major roadblock, a lot of not hearing back from people.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to ask was we talked about interviews of dudes in bands or whatnot. Was there anyone you tried to get in the mix that you just couldn't?
Billy Milano.
Yeah,
He was
that's
very cool though. He has like a reputation of being just like I don't know, very obnoxious or whatever, just like gruff. But I reached out to him a couple times, like along the process, because SOD is great. And at one point, I was like, I want to have all of them in there. And then Charlie ended up not making the cut anyway. I'm sorry, but yeah, he was. I just wrote to him like, "Hey, dude, I'm still doing this thing. Would you maybe still be interested in just anything?" And he'd just be like, "No, thanks." Be like, "All right," you know, like. What do you say to that? I don't know if there was any other like major wants that weren't in there. I don't know, I kind of had to hound dig from Earache, but then you have to remember I'm just like some idiot that has his email address. Like, he's a busy guy, but he wrote back to me eventually.
Was Mustaine easy to get? Because I know you interviewed him.
That we just, I just paid to excerpt his book.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Danny, so when everyone was given their 2 cents on you, did you read any of them prior to it being published, or did you check in on what these dudes were saying about you?
Oh yeah, because there was a lot of kind of like rough drafts of everything,
Mm-hmm.
and I got a bunch of PDFs and various, you know, incarnations of it. So I got to read a lot of that stuff, and yeah, a lot of it was like flattering to the point of being embarrassing. Like, you know, Steve Hughes was like gushing about me, and you know, almost getting a lump in your throat, you know, or like Ross from Immolation, you know, because you know these dudes are your friends and everything, and when you see them talking about you like that, yeah, it's, you know, it's, when it's heartfelt like that. It's yeah, it just makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside.
My favorite interview in the book is in the nuclear assault section. The Gene Hoglan, he tells a story, which I'm not going to spoil it for everyone, but comb to it, read it. I think it is outstanding, and it's great coming from Gene Hoglan, because I think Gene Hoglan is the drummer version of you. I think that he's just, you know, combed through the indie scene, mainstream, whatever, and just kills it every time. He's got such a great rep. Always, everyone has something nice to say about him. So it was great coming from his mouth, what I read there.
He was one where it was just like, he has a like genehoglan.com or whatever, so you just like find the contact thing and email in and hope somebody sees it, you know?
Sure.
Because he came up all the time with the Dark Angel stuff and all that. So, yeah, but he eventually like got back to me, and that was one of those moments, because that's probably my favorite one in there too.
Yeah.
But he, at the very beginning, was just like, he was like, I've told this story to people over the years, but now that you're like giving me the opportunity to have it, like, it's on the record. And he's like, I'm happy to like have this in print finally. And I'm like,
awesome.
what are you about to lay on me here? This is kind of crazy.
It's great.
But yeah, it was awesome. It's just like, okay, I'm doing something that's like valid right now, you know?
Did you wrestle with the title at all, or is that?
Oh yeah.
All right, so give me some second choices, maybe. If you.
I don't think there really even was any. It was just
Okay.
like, can we come up with one good one, or like one that means anything? And that was just kind of like another one of these lightning bolt things where you look at the title of that EP and it's just like, okay, well, it just basically like, it happened very late in the process too, so you're just like, okay, this just sums up him, in my opinion at least, like just constantly going, you know, and like always evolving, basically. I don't know.
Exactly.
And then you have the subtitle to like clue everybody in. It's like, what is this about? Here's the 1-sentence summary that you have to put on the cover. You know?
Absolutely. So, book's outstanding. Well, a couple really off-the-cuff questions really quick. Danny, you're playing with Nuclear Assault tonight. What are your thoughts, just in general, about this resurgence of, frankly, reunion shows from bands? Like, you know, they do the reunion tour, they strike it. We just had the Replacements at the Riv, like, this week, and, like, sold it out, whatever, 3 nights in a row, I'm assuming, or whatever. But that's a reoccurring trend. So what are your thoughts on that, being a fan of music, obviously?
Looks like a lot of people are having midlife crises.
Yeah, exactly.
But if it's relevant, it's great. Sometimes you can see it's a bit cynical with some people, where they're like, oh, gee, you know, I don't know. I don't want to talk shit about anybody. I'm not saying about anybody in particular. With thrash, because you didn't ask that directly, but this genre is never really, you know, ebbed. And when the new generation, it lasted, you know, and stayed popular so long that there's literally kids that could be my kids, you know, who are 20 years old now, and they're just totally into it, and you think, well, shit, you weren't even born until 1995, what would you, it doesn't matter. I mean, what if I like, you know, jazz from the 40s, you know, somebody gonna go, well, you weren't around then, so you shouldn't get to listen to it. But, no, it's just really cool in that aspect, I guess I'm trying to say.
I admit I was slightly skeptical about the whole Brutal Truth thing, but I had never seen them back in the day, so I was excited. But then evolution through revolution is a fucking rager. So it's like, okay, that's a perfect example. Like this band is still completely relevant, you know.
Well, we made sure that that record was just like a fucking hammer. I don't think there's any slow parts on it. We were just like, look, we may be old, but we can still do this. And then twice as fast live. Yeah.
Speaking of Brutal Truth, apparently you guys are breaking up, or you broke up recently. So based on that, I know you're doing the Nuke thing right now tonight, but what's on the docket musically for you right now, Danny?
Well, the thing with the nuclear thing is not going to be... When Brutal Truth reformed in 2006, we did it for another 8 years, whereas with this, it's going to be more kind of like, you know, to make a pun, more like a tactical assault, where we got a bunch of stuff with nuclear where we have a few... Well, you guys are lucky, there aren't many domestic shows right now, but we have a bunch of stuff coming up in Europe in the summer, and then South America. And then we're just going to take it as it comes. We have recorded a 4-song EP that is going to be out soon, that we're going to play some stuff from tonight. And otherwise, I'm still in Venomous Concepts whenever that comes up. I'll still fill in for Shane for Lockup whenever he gets double booked by his booking agent. And I am in a couple of local bands. Well, Blurring didn't make the cut. Nocturnal Hellstorm, the black metal band I'm in, is mentioned in there, but...
Blurring is awesome.
I also...
listen.
You can actually download the whole album on Bandcamp, Blurring, but it's pretty psychotic grind, so hold on to your face. And since, okay, let me address the whole retiring thing. Because every time now, nuclear, I thought you were gonna retire, dude. And what it is that I just didn't want to do stuff where I was sitting in a van for 8 weeks anymore. Brutal Truth was the only band I was doing that was still active to the point where we were in the recording, touring cycle. And it was just literally getting old, you know. So I just wanted to still play music, but not be out there all the time, maybe be a little more selective. But I didn't want to tell the other guys in Brutal Truth, I'm done with this shit, I don't want to do this, so I retired. It was more diplomatic. But as soon as the word got out that I was retiring and I had all this free time, I was bombarded with texts and emails. And like, well, now you got time to do this. Do you want to do this, dude? So I'm like, didn't listen to what I said, did you? But anyway, there's the local bands I'm in, and the whole concept about slowing down a tiny bit is that I have a little studio on my Mac at home, and this juncture, me and the vocalist of Nocturnal Hellstorm are going to be doing a band that is me programming all the stuff that's going to be like if Skinny Puppy and black metal were merged. And which might have been done before, but not by people like us. So that will be interesting too. That's a perfect example of something that we can do now with Bandcamp and have something out and never even have to leave your house. The second Nocturnal Hellstorm album, Dominance and Persecution, was about to come out, but we have some label problems. I can't get into any more than that at the moment, but if somebody wants to release some brutal black metal, just let me know.
Awesome. Dave, writing-wise, anything coming up for you?
No.
Okay. A Billy
This
Lotto
today.
biography. Oh, that's cool. Well, today was awesome. Real quick question, then we'll go to the crowd. This is another question I've been asked for years. You were mentioned once on his show, and I listened to it. Have you ever, being for the East Coast, been mistaken for Howard Stern at all?
Just by idiots.
Just by idiots was the answer, exactly. No, but I think he mentioned it too. It was pretty funny. But besides that, this has been great. I want to throw it out to the crowd right now. Anyone got any questions? You want to come up here and use a mic, or just shout it out from there, and I'll reiterate it over this mic.
I kind of hope nobody has any questions. No?
All right, you gotta go to the venue then.
Guys, thank you so much for coming out. Danny, thank
Thanks.
you so much for being here. Dave, the book's great. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
guys.
Thank you so much.
See you
This is
tonight.
awesome. This is a blast. Thank you.
I'll be at the bar, and I want to try all the local IPAs.